Okay, so for our first project, what we're going to do is we're going to shade some very simple geometric three-dimensional shapes. I've given you two different documents to work from. First of all, the basic shapes JPEG, which is just a regular rasterized JPEG of all these different shapes. And also I've given you the same thing but in a vector form as an EPS. You can work with either one of them, but I'm going to work with the EPS and you'll see why in just a second. The main thing is we're going to shade in and colorize each one of these shapes, and I'm going to show you a specific technique that'll help you color them in very quickly and also kind of a professional way, and that's called using a clipping mask. Notice that in our layers how we've got things set up. First of all, we're going to have our line work on one layer, and that's what layer 1 was. We're going to colorize each one of them in their own specific colors on a second layer, and then we're going to add the highlights and shadows on a top layer. So let's get started. I'm going to close this out. Like I said, I'm going to use the EPS file as my main file to work from, and I'm going to drag it down to Photoshop. When I do open an EPS, since it's vector, it's going to ask me how do I want to rasterize it. I'm going to keep everything the same. 23 by 20 is good enough for me, and we'll say OK to that. And this is what your document is going to look like, especially if you open the EPS. Notice that it's very, very difficult to see the lines, and everything is transparent. That's why you're getting that checkerboard type pattern. So the first thing we need to do is to add a solid white background underneath layer 1. So I'm going to make a new layer, in this case layer 2. I'm going to hit Shift Delete, and that's going to bring up my fill options, and I'm going to fill it in using just white. We'll say OK to that. Since the white layer is on top of this one, we'll click and drag and just reorder it. So let's rename some of these. You can double click on a layer name. We'll call it background. Layer 1 is where our shapes are, so I'll call this the shape outlines. And the next layer we're going to create is where we can fill in the colors. What I don't want to do is to disrupt or destroy any of the lines that I'm working with on these shape outlines. If I started painting on them right now, it would cover up those pixels and I'd completely destroy the image that I'm working on. Instead, I want to be able to preserve this. So to do this, I'm going to make another layer on top of this one. We'll call this solid color. And in this solid colors layer, this is where we're actually going to put the solid flat colors of each of the shapes that we're working on. Let's zoom in so we can see what we're doing. I've also opened up my swatches palette, and I'm just going to use some of these simple swatches to work with. When I colorize them, notice that the default swatches have a mid-tone of a color, then they get lighter, and they also get darker. And this is very helpful when colorizing something very, very quickly. I'm in my solid colors layer. I'm going to use the paint bucket to quickly fill these in. Paint bucket's usually hiding under the gradient tool if you don't see it. So with paint bucket selected, I'm also going to go up to my tool options, and we're going to set this to look at all the layers. Even though I'm working on the color layer, I still want it to look at the layer below it and fill in everything that's inside of it. Continuous is also checked off, and we'll keep everything else pretty much the same. So I'm going to choose a color and then go and click and fill in each one of these options. So in this case, I'll choose red, then clicking inside of the circle, automatically fill in red. Now it accidentally filled in everything. I didn't want it to do that. Probably the reason why is because my tolerance is pretty high. Let's turn down the tolerance to, say, 10%. Now watch what happens when I click. Much, much better. It'll stay inside of that one. Tolerance wasn't high enough to catch that gray line. I'm going to choose another color. In this case, for my box, since I have 3 different sides, I need to have a dark, a mid-tone, and a light side for this box. So when I choose a color, we'll make this one, say, orange. This will be our mid-tone. I'll then choose a darker side and a lighter side and quickly fill it in for there. Choose different colors for each of the shapes that you're working on and give them just a simple color scheme to work with. Really, it doesn't matter what color you're using. I'm kind of choosing a lot of these at random. But once we start creating our different actual still lifes, you may want to pay attention to the local color of what things actually are once they're created. All I'm doing is going back and forth from my swatches palette and choosing one swatch, then another. So there's a darker, maybe this end part is very, very dark. We'll make that one green. And another pink box down here. Alright, fantastic. We've got all of them very quickly colored in with just a solid color. The next thing we need to do is to be able to add the shading to each of these different shapes. I want you to pay attention to how shading actually works. Don't just try to go in and say, oh, I make one side darker and make one side lighter. There's a lot more going on to a real-world shading technique. And that's why I gave you some of these examples to look at. It's always great to look at real-world examples to see how shadows actually act. For instance, if I open up this particular example, you can see the shadow on this sphere. First of all, it's taking up a good half of the entire ball on there. So the darker side is very, very dark, and you can see how quickly it's moving from dark to light. However, the darkest area is this area right about here. It actually gets a lot lighter as you get closer to the table that it's sitting on. This is because of a bounced highlight. Light is bouncing off of the table and hitting the underside of the sphere, and it's lighting it up. So this is a little bit of a reflection that's going on here. This area is called the core shadow. It's the darkest area, and even though it's closest to the highlight, because of this reflected light, it's not the darkest area. This area is the darkest area. Notice our highlight also is moving very quickly, going from a highlight into our midtones that we're working from here. And this is a computer-generated image. Let's look at a real-world type image. This is a great one to see because it's actually a photograph, a little bit of a fuzzy photograph, but here it is again. Here's our darkest area of this sphere that we're working on. Notice the bounced light is lighting up the under edge that we're working with, and our highlight is up here on the top side. So when you do your shading for each of these different shapes, pay attention to how shadows actually work. They're not always as flat as you think they are. Check out this square. The darkest area of the square is this area right here. It actually lightens up a little bit because of the amount of bounced light that's hitting this area. So if I was to shade it, I would make the darkest shades here and actually get gradually lighter. Same way for here. This is a mid-tone. This is much, much lighter from this one. Let's look at one more. You can also look at things that have different textures. In this case, the wooden texture is a lot more dull type finished. There's a lot more mid-tones that we're working with, and only just a little bit of shadow on this side and a little bit of highlight, versus something that's metallic. So these spheres on these metallic balls are very, very reflective. So you've got dark darks and you've got very sharp highlights in midtones for different areas. Look at the cone, how sharp that area in that cone is, and how sharp the area of these shadow different areas are. So paying attention to how light plays on different surfaces is very important when you create the shadows that you're working with. Alright, so that's the shadows and highlights type lecture. Let's jump in and actually add the shadows to this document. To do this, I want you to create what's called a clipping mask. Just as I didn't want to disturb the shape outlines on this layer, so I created a new layer to add the colors, let's make another new layer on top of it, and we'll call this highlights and shadows. So all of the shadows and highlights that we add to these shapes are going to be added into this particular layer. If I was to grab my paintbrush now and start painting, so let's say I wanted to add a darker red to this circle, well, it's going to be very difficult to stay within the circular lines. There's an easier way to work with this. So I'm going to undo this. we're going to create what's called a clipping mask. In your layers, this is on top of this one. Make sure that highlights and shadows is selected. Then go up to the Layers palette and choose Create Clipping Mask. Now let's look at our Layers palette. Now our layers have an arrow pointing down to the solid color layer that we're working with. This means that anything that's painted inside of this layer will only show up if there's something painted inside of this layer. So let me show you what I'm working with. Now I've got my paintbrush selected. When I start to paint, it stays inside of there, but if I accidentally go outside the edge, it won't go very far. It only shows up because I have the red pixels underneath here. And no matter what I paint, it's going to clip itself to that particular shape. Even if I tried to paint in this white area, nothing's showing up. If you look in the layers palette, you can see everything's showing up, but because it's clipped to this layer, then it won't affect anything else. Now if you do accidentally go too far, it will show up on another shape that you're working on. So pay attention to the size of your brush and how close it is that you're working with. If you do want to make your brush very large and not accidentally go into another area, another safe thing to do is to use your marquee tool and to just highlight that particular area. Select the entire thing. You know that if you use your brush and you try to paint anywhere outside of there, now that I'm clicking and dragging, it's not going to go anywhere outside of that marquee. So that's another thing that you can do to work with that. Let's delete this and actually start adding some shading. I'm going to open up one of these and actually look at a real world ball that we can work with. I'll use this one. This is a great sphere to work with because it's not too shiny and it's not too dull. You can see the highlight, you can see the core shadow, and here's a little bit of a reflected light from there. Let's work with our shadows first. I'll zoom into the sphere that I'm working with. We'll move it off to the side so I can see both of them. I'm going to pick up my paintbrush tool. Remember, you can adjust the hardness of the edge to give it either a soft edge or a hard edge, and you can see that this is pretty soft, so maybe I don't want it to be 100% soft, just a little bit hard to it. And another thing is I drop my opacity down to about 30% so that when I paint, I'm not getting 100% dark red. I'm slowly building up that dark area. I'm going to press the F key so that I can see just what I need to work with. So I'm slowly building up that particular area, getting it slightly darker. If you do want to quickly select a color, hold down the Option key. Watch what happens. With the Option key, it turns into the eyedropper, and then now I can pick up a color and just paint with that solid red. Now if I painted it, I can undo and repaint again. Since I've got that red loaded up, if I double click on here, in my foreground color I can choose a darker area, and so let's go even darker than the dark red that we were working with. So now I can get very dark up on that side. Drop my opacity down, and I can shade from here. If I wanted to pick this red up again, click on it, and now I can lighten it back up. To add the highlight, I'm going to hold down my Option key, choose my red, then double click on my swatch, and I know that I'm in the right hue. All I need to do is to drag it and make it slightly lighter. So let's make it something as light as this. So there's my current one. This would be my new lightness. When I back out, maybe I just tap it a couple of times and build up. Ooh, too small. There we go, very big. So very quickly I can make something a lot lighter, undoing all this. There we go. and slowly blending in the highlight that I'm working with. Can make it smaller, get even lighter. Maybe I need to go even lighter with this particular color. There I've got a sphere drawn off as well. So that's one way of adding that particular color. Let's add the shadows to this particular shape. Just as I showed you with the other tools, or excuse me, the other examples, you want one area to be slightly darker and get gradually lighter. Since my light is on this side, I can maybe get the darker edge down at this bottom left-hand corner and get lighter up here, or I can have a bounce shadow and get darker to lighter from here. I'm going to hold down my Option key, choose the color that I'm working with. So this is my local color, and if I need to make it slightly darker, maybe I'll pull it down to here and make my brush a lot bigger and slowly add in that darker shade. Let's get it even darker, almost to black. Since my opacity is at 20%, I don't have to worry about it very quickly blending into that one. I can even make it a little bit lighter. Option, choose the color, make it slightly lighter, then now if I started painting, well, I'm going to get into that edge, so maybe this is where I need to use my marquee tool. So I'm going to choose my, excuse me, not marquee, the magic wand tool. Maybe I'll select that particular area. Now when I choose my brush and I start to paint, I can blend in that area. Let's make it bigger. Very, very big, very, very soft edge brush would very quickly blend it in. Since I've got it selected off, now when I deselect, you can see it has a nice clean edge to this one. Let's try the same thing. Choose your magic wand. I'm going to choose just this top area. In this case, I'm going to make it a little bit darker on one particular edge. Choose my brush, click and get my color, then double click. Maybe we'll lighten up this foreground particular area. Deselect it from there. Notice it's getting lighter into darker. Finally, we'll do it on this mid-tone value. Hold down the Option key, click on it. That gives me my local color. Then I can get slightly darker. Choose the magic wand with it selected. Maybe I'll make this bottom edge slightly darker. And I can deselect it from there. So this looks a lot more realistic, a lot more natural type way of shading. What I want you to do is to finish up the rest of the shading for these other different shapes. Some of them you may have to look up online and see how other people have done shading, particularly for how do you shade these egg shapes, or how do you shade this torus shape down at the very bottom. When you are finished, I want you to save the Photoshop file, save as. Make sure the format is Photoshop, that way it'll save all of your layers as well. I'll choose basic shapes, we'll say OK to that. And then you can, when you turn it in, you'll upload this, or you'll turn it in actually on a CD at the very end of the semester. Just make sure each thing has a highlight and a good shadow shape to work with from there.